energy, energy and work. This can get pretty in the weeds, let's say. So you may know these definitions already. I'm going to go into it in a fair amount of detail and really sort of tinker through it. This is one of those things where if you have a strong background in physics, chemistry, that sort of stuff, you may want to look at the transcript, skim through what I say, and then maybe fast forward to a later part of this presentation or just skip to the next one. So feel free. So energy. Energy is the ability to do work, and we most obviously think of that as physical movement, pushing, pulling, running from place to place. You know, these soccer players are an excellent example of this. Energy comes in two forms, though. Well, energy comes in a lot of forms that we generally classify as either potential, which is position or arrangement, and kinetic. So what do we mean by energy of position or arrangement? Let's use examples. I find that for me, this helps me so much if I think of examples. So energy of position, we might think of maybe a water tower. We have a lot of water that is up high. What's going to happen if you release that valve? It is going to drop. Or energy of arrangement. Maybe we can think of a spring. So something that's can be really tightly coiled. It can be squished and then let go. You don't have to move it from one place to another to squish it. You can just squish it. This is stored energy. Potential energy is energy that is stored, is just sitting there, but can be released at any moment if we change the conditions slightly. And this can also be chemical energy. And I'm going to loop back to this once we've talked about kinetic with these two examples, the water tower and the spring. Kinetic energy is the energy of movement, of motion. So if we're thinking about the water tower, this is the water going down with the force of gravity. If we think of the spring, it's the release of that, or maybe we can call it that boing of letting the spring go. So in that water tower, we put the water way up high, and then we can release a valve, and now that water goes from being potential energy up high to kinetic energy, water flowing. That spring, we compress it, we get it really squished, and then we stop squishing it, and now it boings up. It changes its arrangement. Kinetically, it moves. Heat and light are also kinetic energy. Heat, the energy of molecules actually bouncing around. The fact that truly at a molecular level, nothing is static unless we get to absolute zero, which there really isn't anything in the universe that's quite absolute zero. Light, photons moving from place to place, that is kinetic energy. And also, obviously, movement. Chemical energy can be a little bit harder to think about because it's happening at such a small scale. But we do have examples of chemical energy that are similar to this water tower or this spring. We can have a concentration gradient. So at a molecular scale, at a really tiny scale, we can have, say, a sodium gradient. So we've got something going on where we have lots of sodium on one side of a membrane and very little sodium on the other side of the membrane. While the membrane's still there, there's no holes in it, there's no pores in it, there's no nothing like that. That sodium is potential. It wants to move, we can say, but it can't because there's a membrane in the way. And then we let it go through and it's going to move through. Or we might have oops, we might have ATP, adenosine triphosphate. We'll talk about this a lot when we talk about respiration. ATP is a molecule that has a lot of potential energy stored inside of it, and it is something that it is possible to break, to allow it to sort of boing apart, spring apart, and it is going to go into a couple of pieces, and then that movement of those pieces is potentially useful for letting go of that energy, doing something useful. Energy can be transformed from one type to another. With these examples, that's what I've really been talking about here. We're transforming from water up in a tower to a flow of water that we can maybe harness with a water wheel to do useful work. Go from a compressed spring to a spring that is now allowed to push against something and force it to do something. A chemical gradient where those sodium ions are now allowed to flow through something and do work sort of like a water wheel. An ATP that's allowed to spring apart and maybe move something. Every time you move your muscles, that is thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of molecules of ATP getting broken apart to do tiny pushes to make tiny proteins, make tiny movements, but all together, you move your muscles, you breathe, you sweep your arms dramatically while talking to somebody. I'm moving my lips and doing all of this complicated movement to talk to you. The energy doesn't appear or disappear. It changes from one form to another. And energy can be transferred from one place to another. So we'll use this example of a hydroelectric dam because this is something that is really fairly relevant, especially in the Pacific Northwest. So we've got a reservoir behind the dam up here. And so all of this water, well, really, if we sort of draw this dotted line from the river level, all of this water is above the level of the water in the river down below. And so that is higher than it quote unquote wants to be. Once that is released, it is going to flow downhill. When it is allowed to flow through this intake, yes, you could just have a hole that lets it flow through and doesn't do anything, or you can have it run a turbine that is going to spin. You now change the form of that energy. It's the kinetic energy of water moving to the kinetic energy of this turbine moving, which then, through some complicated physics that I understand but have trouble explaining, causes electrons to move, which then generates power, which can be transmitted long distance, come into your house, and then that movement of electrons can be transformed into any number of useful things for us. It can be transformed into light on your television screen. It can be transformed into heat in your electric water heater or maybe your electric baseboard heaters. It can be transformed into the mechanical movement of your coffee grinder, grinding your coffee in the morning. All of these complicated transformations and transferals are happening all the time in the world around us, in your body, between your body and the outside world, in order to make stuff happen, in order to do useful work. So what useful work needs to happen? Why do you need energy? I love this. It may look like I'm doing nothing, but at the cellular level, I'm really quite busy. So what do cells have to do? And remember, we're made of cells, so all of this stuff is stuff our body has to do in order for us to stay healthy. Well, one big thing is the chemical work of building molecules. You're going to take in food. That food all gets broken down into its constituent parts. So it's not going to be whole enzymes that are going from your lettuce to your body, but instead, the enzymes in that lettuce get broken down into individual amino acids, and then those individual amino acids get taken up in your digestive tract, and then if a cell in your body needs to make an enzyme, It's going to take all of those amino acids and build them, put them together. The building something, making something from its constituent parts, this is an energy requiring process, whether your cells are doing it, whether you are building something DIY at home, whether a building is getting constructed. There also is transport work, pumping substances across membranes. We have to get those amino acids from inside the digestive tract to inside the cells in your digestive tract, then out of those cells into your bloodstream, then from your bloodstream into the cell that needs to make the enzyme. There's lots of transporting that has to happen if we're going to build those molecules. There's also a lot of transport that happens when you are doing things like, for example, making that sodium gradient, or making a potassium gradient, or calcium gradient, etc., etc. These are really important for your nerve cells to fire. In order for your muscles to actually do their thing, in order for your nerve cells to fire, there need to be these really big ion gradients. These ion gradients takes a lot of energy to build them, to actually make that gradient occur. There's also mechanical work. So the beating of cilia or flagella, getting that mucociliary escalator in your lungs to sweep all of that gunk out of your lungs. Beating those cilia is mechanical work. We have to actually make movement happen, make that go. Whenever you move your muscles, that is something that requires a lot of ATP to make that happen. All of this sort of baseline cellular work is your resting metabolic rate. Now, resting, so this doesn't mean movement of your skeletal muscles to go for a run, maybe run for the bus, maybe lift your backpack, whatever it is. This is just, hey, your muscles that you're using to breathe, your muscles that are keeping your digestive tract moving. But putting together all of this work, building molecules, pumping stuff across membranes, cilia and flagella, your smooth muscle going, this is we call your resting metabolic rate. This is the amount of energy you need every single day just to maintain your body. We measure this in capital C calories, which are called kilocalories. So you probably remember 1 calorie, little c calorie, is the energy to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. And this is something that can trip you up if you know physics and you're looking at nutrition. This calorie, little c, is not the same as the calorie, big C or kilocalorie, that is on a nutrition label. So you can't just sit around and drink, say, cold soda and lose weight, because this calorie, so let's say you have a liter of ice cold soda. So that is 1,000 mils, aka a kilogram of water. And if it's ice cold, it's at 0 degrees Celsius. And so we're taking 1 kilogram of water from 0 C to 37 C degrees. That's going to be 37 kcal. That's going to be 37 kilocalories. So if you drink a liter of ice cold soda, you will burn 37 calories, heating that all the way up to your body temperature. But there's a lot more calories than that in a liter of soda. So you can't just sit around drinking ice cold beverages and eating ice cream and lose weight. Sorry to break it to you. There are formulas to calculate this that are available widely online. And in the Assessing Your Nutrition and Activity homework, there's also formulas for this. And this is something that was come up with, and then a lot of people have over time made this better. Now, one thing that I will say is that your resting metabolic rate, you can come up with those calculations, but if you actually were to look at the data that they use to calculate people's resting metabolic rate, it's based on your kilograms of body weight controlling for biological sex and your resting metabolic rate in kcal. It does form this sort of nice slope, but when you look at the individual data points, they're pretty all over the place, which means that two people who are the same weight, let me make that a solid line, that's a little more visible. Two people that are the same weight could have very widely different resting metabolic rates, neither of which is actually what the formula would predict. So when it comes to figuring out what your resting metabolic rate is, how many calories your body specifically needs in order to survive day to day, you are going to have to do a little experimentation because it can vary really widely depending on factors including your genetics and also your weight history. Unfortunately, people who have crash dieted before, that has a tendency to depress your resting metabolic rate for reasons that really aren't entirely clear.